but there's no reason why, you know, an administrative academy specializes in food service. I mean, it might be better to get a food service specialist company to come in and provide the cafeteria services. That's the general idea. I mean, obviously in contracting of all sorts, you know, the government isn't in the business of building jet airplanes or tanks or things like that, so you contract out to people that can provide that kind of service. All the public-private partnerships we've been talking about are, you know, an aspect of this, right? To take advantage of the expertise, you know, that exists in private sector organizations that the government doesn't necessarily have. And so this separating the policymaker from the implementer became another big component of state reform. Public expenditure tracking surveys, again, this is kind of related to performance measurement. You know, the World Bank got into this in a big way because they tried to actually follow money as it left the Treasury and tried to go down all the way to the frontline service providers in the school system. You know, the first one of these was done in Uganda, and they found out that for every dollar that left the Ugandan Treasury, only 20 cents was actually arriving at the school. And the other 80 cents was being siphoned off at some intermediate level in the bureaucracy, you know, mostly in the form of corruption. And obviously you can't solve that problem unless you can measure it and unless you can detect it, right? So I guess the final issue is shortening the route of accountability. So if you go back to, let's see, go back to this chart. So the route of accountability, you know, finally the implementing organizations provide services to citizens, and the citizens are simultaneously the people that vote for the government. So there is accountability in a democratic system, you know, through elections. If you're not getting good services at this end, you vote for a different party or a, you know, different set of candidates, and they will presumably give instructions through this long chain of command and make your local school better. You know, but the problem is that formal system of accountability is a long route, and there's a lot of noise in the signal. So let's say your local school isn't performing well, so you vote for another party. 2 years later in the election, they appoint a different minister of education. Is that minister of education actually going to respond to your, you know, your complaint? The answer is probably not, because they won't even, you know, that signal will be lost among a lot of noise in the long route system. And so the idea was you shorten the route of accountability by directly having citizens participate in, you know, in the school management. And so this, you know, there's a lot of forms of this, like the city of Porto Alegre in Brazil became famous for participatory budgeting, where citizens were invited to sit, you know, they were given information on the municipal budget, invited to give direct input into how the money was being spent by the city, and not having to vote in an election and wait until the next electoral cycle, you know, to see some improvement and some accountability in that system. Okay, so all of these different approaches have something in common. They're all done under this principal-agent framework. They all have to do with changing incentives using a monitoring and accountability framework. So monitoring and accountability is a nice way of saying we're going to watch people very carefully and either reward or punish them depending on what their behavior is, right? And that's probably been the major route to getting better accountability and better service delivery in the public sector over the last 2-3 decades by changing the agents' incentives in those various ways. All of them have in common the fact they're trying to mimic market mechanisms, increase competition, create the equivalent of bankruptcy, right? The voucher system in the public schools, the theory was that a school could go bankrupt, in effect. A public school could go bankrupt if they lost all their students as a result of poor performance, right? So it would create those incentives to deliver better services in the public sector. But the problem is that principal agent only goes so far in terms of being able to really fix it. So I guess before we get to these qualifications, I should say that this system works in a lot of cases. In a lot of American cities, for example, using performance management, carefully tracking service delivery and then providing either positive or negative incentives for better or worse behavior actually increase the efficiency of municipal government. That New York police example was a classic one. Bill Bratton, as police commissioner, was famous because the crime rate went way down, the number of arrests and citizen security, started to go up under his administration because he could accurately measure the performance of all of his frontline workers. All right. So I'm not saying that this doesn't work, but there are limits to it. So first of all, if you can't measure something, you can't hold people accountable, and it's frankly, quite hard to measure the performance of a lot of things that people do in the public sector, right? The public sector delivers services primarily, and services are just inherently hard to measure. So the classic case of this, again, is teachers, right? So so has India engaged in this sort of thing of trying to use performance measurement in education, where you use student test scores?
In government, they started at the higher level.
Yeah.
We had a performance management unit at the ministerial office level, where every department was to make a RFD, what is their plan for the year, and then there were targets on that, whether they could, but it didn't work beyond a point.
Yeah.
It did work.
But in the
years, people did make their plans, it was being monitored, but then there was no incentive thereafter.
In the education system, though, have you tried to use?
There is something called a NAS.
Uh-huh.
So basically, it measures academic achievement of every grade of students. This is done almost on an annual basis.
Right. And then that's used to sanction poor performing schools?
No, that is not being done.
Yeah.
It is only for gathering information. Reward punishment metrics is still not being linked, but tests have been introduced so that outcome measurements are started.
Yeah. So you have the monitoring, but you don't have the accountability, right? Well, I mean.
Public sector also, we have got memorandum of understanding with the government.
Uh-huh.
All PSUs have to have a memorandum of understanding with the government where the performance indices are given, the targets are set, and accordingly the same is being done. And there is the incentive is now recently 3-4 years back it has been reduced also. Performance related incentive
But there is no negative to it, no? So that is
definitely you're reading the complete reading and accordingly you won't get the PRP.
So it is there for the Maharatna and Uniratna, I think.
Yeah, so I think, in general, the idea is fine, that you measure people's performance and you reward them on the basis of it. It's very hard to implement in many cases. So in the United States, George W. Bush rolled out something called No Child Left Behind, which was then continued by the Obama administration, where nationally across all 50 states there would be a uniform set of standardized tests that would be given to children in primary and secondary schools, and then the schools would be rewarded if their test scores were better. So this led to the scandal that I just mentioned, where there's such a pressure to do well on the test scores that you cheat, and then it leads to this other problem that the teachers teach to the test. They know what's going to be on the test, and so they don't actually pay attention to what's important to teach. They simply teach in order to raise their scores and therefore protect their school budgets and that sort of thing. And the other problem is, if you just think about it, the connection between the performance of an individual teacher and their students' performance on a standardized test is very, there's probably a connection there, but it's not a very strong one, because a lot of educational research indicates that the real thing that determines a student's performance is not the school, it's actually neighborhood and family. And if you live in a well-educated neighborhood with lots of books in the home and parents that encourage you to work hard, you're just going to do better. And even in a bad school, you're going to do better than a child that comes from a very poor, illiterate family where the parents are working and not paying any attention and so forth. And so there's some things that are just inherently, I think, difficult to measure. You've got a problem of multiple principles. We saw that in the case of Hyderabad, right? And I think, when Kent taught that course, that case, he noted the fact that actually everybody is giving the water board different instructions. So the poor constituents and their elected representatives want basically free water. The commercial interests want continuous water that's reliable. The middle class people, have slightly different interests, and you can't satisfy all of these simultaneously. So principal agent doesn't work if you've got multiple principles that are actually telling the bureaucracy to do contradictory things. And then finally, this theory doesn't tell you how much discretion to delegate. I'm going to go into that in much greater detail in a second. So just to illustrate, some of these points, what is measurable. So this is one way of doing it that comes out of my book on state building. So in this chart, transaction volume is measured along the x-axis. That is to say, government agency makes very few decisions or transactions. They're down here. If they make a lot of transactions, they're up here. Specificity is how easy is it to measure the activity of that particular agency, okay? And the question is, which of these quadrants leads to the best accountability? And I think the answer is quadrant 1, because you can measure the performance very accurately, and there are not that many transactions, all right? So if you put some actual agencies into that matrix, central banking, I think, is a classic case of low transaction volume, high specificity. The central bank is located in the capital city. It's not a large agency. It only makes a small number of decisions. Every 6 weeks, do we raise or lower interest rates? I mean, obviously they do more than that, but the major activity of the central bank is really, really visible, and therefore it's very easy to hold them accountable. On the other hand, if you think about something like primary school teaching, guidance counseling, guidance counseling, how do you measure the performance of a guidance counselor? A guidance counselor is giving a high school student career advice. Is it good or bad? The student himself or herself won't know for another 10 years whether, and even in 10 years you may not know whether that was good advice or bad advice, right? So extremely difficult to measure. Things like court systems, police, they all fall in this high transaction volume, low specificity quadrant. And so if you look across the world over the last 30 years, there actually has been a lot of improvement in public sector performance, but almost all of it has come up in this area, right? So central banks, finance ministries are incomparably better than they were 30 years ago. Like 30 years ago, you had the debt crisis in Latin America, sub-Saharan Africa. A lot of countries got in trouble because they had incompetent central bankers. They had budget deficits. They really couldn't control inflation, all these things. And that, generally speaking, there are a few exceptions like Venezuela, which are still suffering from these problems. But for the most part, those agencies have gotten much better. Where we really have big problems is down in this quadrant, right, where you've got high transaction volume and low specificity activities that are hard to measure, and therefore it's hard to apply this accountability framework, where you're rewarding and punishing people based on measured performance. And so I think this is kind of my summary of where all the principal agent stuff ends you up. Principal agent really works. It works better in this region than it does in this region, all right? And most of the gains in performance using those techniques have come in that kind of activity. So the question then is, how do you fix things down here? How do you fix things where you can't measure all that well? You got a lot of workers, you got a lot of frontline workers out there, and they're not all sitting in your capital city, and you may not be able to monitor them terribly effectively. It cannot be the case that all countries are bad at doing stuff in that region, because there are many countries that have good primary, secondary education. They've got good police, security, personal security is good, and they're not using a monitoring and accountability framework in order to do that. So how does that happen? And my view is it's because you're making use, I'm sorry, this is just another illustration of this problem of multiple principles. So I think the real answer to that is there's an alternative way of motivating people, which has to do with this social capital or more sociological approach using norms. So human beings are not just homo economicus, they're not simply these rational utility maximizers, they're also these social creatures that are responding to social norms and social signals. People are motivated by things like pride, self-respect, group norms, especially in organizations, because in an organization you're right next to your fellow workers, and they're monitoring you and they're checking whether you're following the group norms, and it means that social capital is actually an important source of organizational performance. So I'm not saying that principal agent and monitoring is not important for people in professional positions. So at most American universities, students grade the professors, and the professors, if I think they're doing their job, read the student, comments. And actually, I think that incentives, even for professionals, are important. So if you're not being paid adequately, you're not going to do your job, as well as you could. If you feel that you're being disrespected because you're not getting adequate pay. So I think that the idea is not that monitoring and accountability is not important in these kind of high-skilled jobs. It's just that it's not enough. It's not enough to produce, the top level of performance, and you need this kind of internal motivation that comes out of things like, like social capital. So I'm going to run through these.
One question.
Yes.
In your quadrant earlier, where would you place, Congress or legislatures? I mean, on the one hand, accountability is there if you win an election or not, but the measure for what goes into that is not entirely clear.
Yeah, so there, it's a little bit different because they are kind of, so first of all, how do you measure the performance of a legislator? Well, there is a certain measurement of that, because in the next election, your opponent is going to say, that person promised that there'd be a hospital in this neighborhood, and where's the hospital, right? So in that sense, accountability is working. The problem is that, the legislator can take credit for stuff that they're really not responsible for. Their voters can forget that they made the promise and they didn't deliver. They can blame poor delivery of services on, well, it wasn't my fault, I tried to do my best. And then finally, a lot of voters don't vote for politicians based on how well they delivered services. They vote for them because they've been bribed. They vote on ethnic grounds or religious grounds, or caste grounds or whatever. So that accountability link is, I think, broken fairly easily. But actually, legislators are under a fair amount of scrutiny. A frontline bureaucrat is not going to be subject to media scrutiny on a routine basis unless there's a horrible scandal, and then it's only going to be retrospective, whereas legislators are pretty well monitored. And so I think that accountability, is more likely to work in their case than in the case of, let's say a school teacher in a rural district, all right? Okay, I'm not going to pay much attention. I mean, the basic, we've touched on this in several of the lectures or several of the cases. Trust is really important, right? Trust between citizens, trust between citizens and the government. No government has enough trust. There are constantly problems of the failure of government to perform because citizens basically don't trust the government. And so one of the issues is how do you generate that trust? So you think about a society, it's got all sorts of networks of trust where people learn to cooperate with one another, and it also works in organizations,